Hey guys, welcome back to Saree Not Sorry. I'm Medha.
And I'm Shreya. This is the fourth episode of the Saree Not Sorry podcast. So this week we have our friends Jaime and Roshan from the Gen Z Unfiltered podcast joining in for the episode.
We're so excited to have Jaime and Roshan with us. Y'all want to introduce yourselves real quick?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Jaime, and I'm currently a first year attending school in Boston.
And I'm Roshan, and I go to school with Medha and Shreya at NYU.
All right, thanks. So this week's topic is a serious one, and we're going to have a much-needed conversation about the recent events surrounding Asian American violence.
We realized that our podcast is a South Asian focused podcast, but as South Asians, we wanted to extend the support to our fellow Asians and encourage discourse about the increasingly important issue of Asian American violence.
Yeah, so this is just four Asian Americans having a conversation. One thing we wanted to talk about is when you introduce yourself, what sort of information do you like to mention? What sort of information do you think is important to let people know when you're introducing yourselves?
So something I like to mention, especially now that I'm in New York, is like where I'm from, as in like the fact that I'm from Tennessee. And it's weird sometimes because I feel like when I mention that I'm from the South, people like do get a little judgy, thinking that, the South is very racist. And, there are a lot of issues with the South, and those issues definitely exist. But it was something that kind of, I guess, took me by surprise that people would mention to my face when I'd be like, "Oh, I'm from the South," and the response would be like, "Wow, isn't it pretty racist down there?" Because like I am a person of color, so that was something that I wasn't quite expecting, but it's still something that I feel like I need to mention. Sometimes I think if I'm around the right people, I sound very Southern.
No, I totally resonate with that because I'm also from Tennessee, and whenever I tell them that I'm from the South, they kind of view it as like a very exotic characteristic almost. And so they're like, "Wow, like you're from the South, like how is it down there?" As if like we're part of some like other country and like not in the US. It's really interesting. And like because of that, I think it's like become more of my identity, and like that's something I definitely mention whenever I like tell people like where I'm from and stuff. It's been a change coming up to the north and like having to mention that to people to kind of give them like a context of like where I'm coming from and stuff.
Yeah, I definitely understand that, especially someone who's not from New York. I'm from like the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and a lot of times I'll say Washington, D.C. instead of Northern Virginia. I do that exactly to avoid the kind of treatment y'all are talking about. But I think also when we talk to people face to face, a lot of things that at least I've experienced, like people will ask, "Where are you really from?" And they'll try to get into like your demographics and like your ethnicity. And it's interesting because like we all identify as people who are like, you guys all said you identify as people who come from like Tennessee or like New Jersey for Shreya, and like, but people when they look at us they think, oh, that may not be where we would expect them to be from, so we want to press further to ask more about where they're really from. And it's like, no, I'm really from Washington, D.C. What do you want me to say? And it's like, where do you want me to go from that?
Right.
But it's just so interesting about people will look at you and automatically make an assumption about you and want you to include that in your introduction, even though it may not be the first thing that y'all are thinking about, because that's not what you think. That's not how you identify necessarily as your first trait that someone should know about you.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, like when I came to New York, like I am from New Jersey, so it's not really surprising that I'm brown. But I think like when I first moved from India, then a lot of people would ask, like when I'm introducing myself to someone outside of school, they'd be like, "Oh, where are you from?" And I'm like, "Oh, I'm from Connecticut, like that's where I live," whatever. And then like it's just like pure ignorance, I think. It's just like when they're asking, they're like, "Oh no, but where are you like from?" And I'm like, "I'm from Connecticut." But if you just phrase it a different way, I can give you a different answer. But yeah, I think that definitely plays into like introducing ourselves and like people just, I don't know, ignoring, like not asking the right questions.
Yeah, and I think that definitely is like non-understanding and non-wanting to understand other people is what causes like the anti-Asian sentiment that exists in this country, and that's been festering, that's been causing a lot of the violence that's happening now, and even caused violence previously, but we're only bringing light to it now. And so it's interesting to see like what's happening right now is a reflection on that ignorance and that question of people asking, okay, yeah, you're telling me that's where you're from, but I don't believe you. And there's a certain level of ignorance and disrespect there for you as an individual and for your entire ethnicity as a whole. It's like to be unaccepting of diversity.
Yeah, I think we can all like agree that like I think these comments or whatever are always like normalized against Asians. I think it's always just, oh, like, you know, it's a normal thing, like people ask this, we just like look over it. And I think I'm just glad to see that people are starting to realize that this has not been a thing that just started happening a couple of months ago. Like this has been a thing for a while. Like people have had to deal with it, but we've also been told to just like overlook these comments and just like, you know, turn the other cheek. Like it's fine. Someone just said it. Just move on. Whatever. But yeah, I'm just glad to see that people are starting to like pay attention to it and not make it like a normal thing.
I think you bring up an important point when you say like there's that ignorance with like not wanting to understand their culture, and like they kind of just cherry pick the things that they do care about, like our like music or like our food, and like they just kind of ignore the rest of it. And like even when we do try to like explain ourselves or like tell them more about our backgrounds, they just kind of, you know, just muffle it out and just, you know, focus on the things that they do really want to know about. And it's just really upsetting. Yeah, because honestly, like I feel like there have been so many instances where like Caucasian people or like, you know, non-BIPOC people, like they go on and on about their like background and like how they like grew up doing all these like cultural things, and then when we try to explain, they kind of just ignore it and they're like, oh, it's so exotic, like we don't really want to know.
Yeah, it's like, thanks for telling me about Easter. Can I please tell you about like Holi that just happened a couple weeks ago? And it's like they don't want to hear about it. I totally understand. And it's like even Holi for us, that's like it's like a festival where you like throw colors at each other. Like that's what you do to celebrate. But there's also a lot of other religious aspects that are behind that. And Caucasian people will just do color runs. I mean, you don't want to hear about our religious festival, but you'll decide to rip off the fun part of it and do all that, but not want to hear about its origins. Well, then what was the point of us celebrating our culture in the first place? And it kind of just makes us feel less valued as a whole, as a part of society.
Yeah. And like going back to what Jamie said, like about like cherry picking, I think like right now especially, like people enjoy boba, people enjoy like Korean food, Indian food, like all sorts of like different cuisines, but right now they're just choosing to ignore what's happening or just kind of like brush over it, which is just not okay.
Yeah, like where
like
were
if you're
you
gonna enjoy the culture, then understand like what's going on and like do something about it.
Yeah, where was this appreciation when you were teasing us about how our food was smelled in the cafeteria in second grade? Where was that respect and sentiment? It's because they have no respect for it. They just, like Jamie said, they only want what they think is good or acceptable or could be integrated into a whitewashed narrative. So speaking of the status quo and what's happening right now, and we talked about how things have kind of been festering for a while. So do you guys have any stories, if you're comfortable sharing, of experiences with racism or microaggressions?
Fortunately, in the US, for me, I haven't experienced very much racism, but there have been a few microaggressions. I guess that does count as racism. Once someone asked me, like, you know, like, where are you from? And I was like, oh, I'm from here. I'm from, you know, for privacy reasons, I'm not going to say the city, but like, I'm from here. And and they were like, no, but like, where are you really from? Like, are you Egyptian? And I was like, what do you mean? He's like, well, you know, like, are you Egyptian? Have you gone to the pyramids? And, you know, when I first thought of pyramids, he's like, having gone to the pyramids, I thought he meant like, we have a pyramid in our city. Like, that's what he was talking about, not the pyramids of Giza. It was just, it was so weird, right?
Egypt.
Like, who would just say that outright? Another time I was in a class, and someone asked, like, how do you do the Indian head bob?
No, yeah. I mentioned this in like a couple of episodes ago, but when I first moved from India, then people would ask like where I came from, and this one girl that I talked to just had no idea where India was. She thought I was in like Europe or something. And then when I told her I was born in Egypt, she was like, oh, isn't Egypt in India? And I was like, nah, that is so wrong.
Maybe she was friends with the guy who asked if Roshan was Egyptian.
Maybe they were.
They all went to the same private school, and that's where they got their information.
Oh my god. Oh, no, yeah.
It's telling to see how implicitly racist the education system is as well in this country. I mean, as someone who went through the entire education system, K through 12, in like public schools, I like never once really learned about my own culture in the class. Why are we only learning the Western perspectives of culture and only things that happen to Caucasian cities? Like, we'll hear about what happened in like ancient Greece, but I won't hear about what happened in ancient India. I feel like I should have learned about that, but you don't.
Yeah.
Unless you take a world history course, which forces you to kind of learn the basics.
Right.
Honestly, like once I moved up to the north, I like see things that happened in the south a lot clearer and like in a different perspective. And so like things that I thought like in that moment weren't racist, I now realize that they were. And like one thing that I thought about was I had this one teacher in 7th grade, and you know, like in middle school, they have like these like diversity days or like diversity weeks where like, or at our school, we have this thing where each classroom chooses a country and they like decorate their door based on that. And like you like have presentations, and then like different classes go around to different classrooms learning about their own country. And so I remember our teacher chose my friend and I to work on our country, and it happened to be China, and I'm Korean. And so I don't think she even like thought about asking us like where we were from, or she like just drew the relationship that we were East Asian and that like maybe we were Chinese. Like she didn't even like try to get to know like where we were actually from or like where our native countries are. And so she like told us to do all this research, and we were like the only 2 people chosen to research that country. And so to us it was like so ignorant, and like just the fact that she would just point us out and like tell us to work on it when there were like so many other kids that could also get to know another country's culture. It was just very like hurtful. And like the fact that, I mean, like not that like China is like a bad country or anything, just the fact that she didn't even like consider the fact that we could have been from any other East Asian country.
Right.
It was just like, wow, like she really doesn't care. It's just we look Asian, and so she just chose us to work on it. But
Right.
it was very interesting. And she also, I don't know if it was because she was just bad at names in general, but the whole entire year she called my name by like the other girl's name, and we were in her homeroom, and we don't even look alike.
Right.
And I'm just like, maybe you should have like paid more attention and like actually gotten a chance to like know our faces and like connect the names.
Right.
But also she like messed up some other people's names in the class, so maybe she was just bad at names. But just like the whole topic of names in general, like there was just so much hidden instances of racism that like people just don't even talk about, and it's just
No, I
there's a lot.
definitely understand
There's a
that, and
lot.
I feel that because like in my high school was like 90% Asian, and so for us, like we would have some Caucasian teachers who would just not bother to learn any of the Asian kids' names. And with a class where 90% of the class is Asian, how do you expect to get through the entire year without even knowing people's names? But that's what they used to do. And so she would get me and all of my friends that were South Asian, all of our names confused, but they would always get the Caucasian students' names correct. And it just goes back to people saying that, like, all Asian people look the same. Like, how does that even make sense? To us, we all look very distinct. It's just you who doesn't even want to look at our faces because you don't want to look into our eyes and, like, see the fact that you've been, like, racially profiling us and, like, being so ignorant towards us for so long. And it's just so frustrating. Even if, like, we take your instance at their highest ground and assume that that teacher is just bad with names, like it doesn't matter, because that's an experience that so many different people have had with so many different Caucasian people, that it clearly shows that there's a stigma and an issue within the Caucasian community where they just refuse to acknowledge the fact that ethnicities do not define other individuals. Everyone is a human and you need to treat them like they're human, and give them the basic respect.
Yeah. I think like assumptions are also such a big part of like something that we've normalized, because everyone, if they see someone South Asian, they're like, oh, you're probably Indian. Like if they see someone East Asian, they're like, oh, you're probably Chinese. And it's like there are other countries that have like the same like there's just other countries like in South Asia. It's not just India. There's Pakistan. There's Bangladesh. Like
Within the South
in
Asian
East Asia.
diaspora, there's like 6 countries, plus the Maldives,
Exactly.
plus the Caribbean. There's so many.
Yeah.
And same goes for East Asians diaspora.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's just something again that we've normalized because like someone will see someone be like, oh, like you're probably Chinese, and like they just label that without even like asking questions or just like at least just trying to find out. They just come to that assumption like all by themselves, which is just another thing that's been normalized.
And it's not even hard.
Don't try to guess. Like, if you know that you don't know like all the different countries in like Asia, like don't try to just kind of guess your way through. Like, we're not some exam. Like, it's not multiple choice.
Right.
Like, there's a lot more options than that.
Right.
Like,
And some people
Exactly.
can be from multiple backgrounds.
right,
And like
right,
there are
right.
South Asian people
So
who
true.
look like East Asian people and vice versa. And it's like you can't make those kinds of assumptions. And even outside of like the Asian community.
Something that I think is just so simple and goes a long way is learning someone's name, right? There's a book and I forgot what it's called. I think it's called How to Win Friends and Influence People, and
Yes,
I remember
I've heard of
reading
this
that book.
Yeah.
Dale
and
Carnegie, right?
yeah, Dale
I
Carnegie.
have it on my shelf right now, yeah.
And like he has like a whole section where he talks about how person's name is the most important thing to that person, and I totally agree, right? And actively trying, or not actively trying, but maybe not even making an effort to learn someone's name properly, I think goes a long way towards hurting someone mentally and emotionally.
Also,
Right.
like, aside from like pronunciation, I've also had so many instances where people just can't spell my name correctly. And like, it's not even like it's an ethnic name, like, it's not Korean. And like, they always spell it Jamie.
Right.
Like, even on Instagram, when I like reply to someone's comment and then they reply back, they would literally type Jamie, even though my like username shows up next to it. And that, like, even if they don't think it's like a
Right.
attack on me, like, I view it as like, oh, they didn't take the time to like actually like see how it's spelled and like just take like precautions in that area, like,
Yeah.
because names, like, if you spell it wrong, then
Yeah.
you're basically referring to them as like a different person. And so for me, like,
Right.
that was also a really big issue. Like, in elementary school, I remember I got like a certificate in 5th grade and they spelled my name wrong.
And it's
you
like the
see
bare
it-
minimum. Like
Exactly.
just
And like,
know
if
how
you
to
see
spell
it
a name.
repeated times, like, maybe it would like register in someone's
Right.
mind.
That's a story I think that's true for a lot of people who don't have like traditional names, and even even traditional names, if they're from an ethnic background, people will just assume that it's something crazy. I mean, my name is 5 letters and it's like very easy to sound out. But regardless, without fail, every single teacher that I've ever had, they will pause at my name and they will not know how to pronounce it, and they won't even try to pronounce it. And I think that's probably like the biggest blow for me, because it's like, my name is 5 letters, and it's like, it's not even like an exotic combination of 5 letters. It's like, you can pronounce it Medha, that's fine. That's how you read it. I understand. I'll correct you. But like, to not even try is just very sad on your end, especially if you're an English teacher. Why are you a teacher if you can't take chances on how you pronounce words? It just does not make sense to me whatsoever. And I think like, even like, to your example about the certificate, my 2nd grade teacher, the entire year she pronounced my name Meha. And it just made no sense to me whatsoever. Because it's like, I knew she had a student named Neha the year before that, and she was South Asian, and so I'm South Asian, so you just assume that our names are the same, but my name has a D in it. Like, how can you not see the D? And my mom corrected her multiple times, I corrected her multiple times, but she just didn't care. And it just felt like something that shouldn't have happened but did happen. But I guess all of this is what leads to what we're seeing today, which is increased violence against people from the Asian community. And I think that's like something really important to address, which is that like this racism has become so normalized that it's encouraged violence against Asian Americans, because people think it's okay to make fun of and be racist towards this this group of people. So then they think it's okay to take it a step further and forcefully try to get them to leave your country, when in reality it's everyone's country. Anyone who lives here, it's your country as well. It's like, no one can really make that assumption that like you don't belong here as much as someone else
Right.
belongs here.
I mean, there's definitely a stereotype that Asian Americans maybe are, in quotations, I say like supposed to be the best or something, right? And people don't realize that that can be hurtful to someone's
Right.
self-esteem, especially.
Yeah. Because they just assume and they'd be like, oh, well, you're smart, I guess. So just because you're Asian, so I guess it works. And then it kind of just like sets a standard somehow. Because then you keep believing that, like, I guess because I'm Asian, I should be smarter. And it's just, I don't know, it's ridiculous.
Like, I think like the whole stereotype that Asians are like good at math or something, like that often made me feel like used or like disposable. Like a lot of my friends would just text me for homework answers, and like they'd ask me like, oh, what'd you get for number 7? And then we just stopped talking. Like that went on with like so many of my different friends. And so they just kind of like use that as like, they almost like take advantage of you at that point. So it's really hurtful.
Yeah.
And if you're not up to par, it feels a little bit like imposter syndrome within your own ethnicity. But it's like, you are your ethnicity. Your level of math should not determine whether or not you're a valid part of that ethnicity. But I think that's something that also caused a lot of internalized racism within Asians, because it would pit other Asians against each other. And I think also the model minority myth, beyond just pitting other Asians against each other, it pitted Asian Americans against other minorities in the United States, because it meant the model minority myth implies that one minority is significantly more valuable to the workforce and the economy, and therefore better, in quotes, than the other minorities in our country. And I think that, again, was kind of used as a weapon to divide minorities instead of having them all stand together. Because then it's like, if the Asian minority is better than the Black minority, for example, in terms of the economy, then clearly we need more Asians, and we should send all people part of the African American minority away from the country. And it just doesn't make sense, because as minorities, we should all stand together. And when the myth doesn't even exist in the first place, like, how does someone's biological like ethnicity make any difference into how you perform academically? It just does not make sense. But like, that kind of myth caused things like people who come from different backgrounds to be like not considered for roles at all, just because of what their names sound like or what their ethnicity is.
Yeah. I feel like that also like ties to the idea of just like normalizing everything. Like, people assume that you want to be held to this standard, and they're like, shouldn't you, like, they'll try to call you out if you call someone out on it, and they'll be like, well, we're making you seem like the model minority, so like, why wouldn't you be grateful about it? But it's like, because they're so used to just these assumptions, they don't see a problem with it. And I think that, again, just ties to the idea of just like normalizing everything, and just kind of saying like, you should be grateful that we've held you to this higher standard, because now we see you as quote unquote valuable.
Yeah, it's like a tool for white supremacy to continue to exist and prosper.
And like the whole concept of like generalizing one race to like one stereotype or anything like that, like it really goes against like the American prideful like concept of individuality. Like, we're like all coming from different backgrounds, and we all have like different skill levels and like different unique identities, and like they kind of just ignore that and make it not apply to people of color. And so it's just like very exclusive almost. It's like, oh, Caucasian people can have like a wide range of skills and different things that they can be good at, but for Asian people, we're all just gonna assume that they're good at math. Like, it just doesn't make sense.
Right.
Yeah, and then it just caused resentment from non-Asian people of color towards Asian people, and it causes Asian people to be more to try to be a little bit more pandering towards whiteness. That shouldn't happen. There shouldn't be this inequality in between every single ethnicity perpetuated by racist stereotypes. When in reality, like you said, it should be people with individualistic characteristics finding other people who embody similar characteristics that they want to be friends with. It shouldn't be like this imbalance that's causing other people to dislike or like other people, that's driven by people's ethnicities.
And like, going off of that point, like, I remember when I moved to New Jersey, like there is like a huge Asian population for sure, and there was at my high school. And I remember like a lot of people who had like ethnic names, they turned their name, they kind of like they thought of like a white name to call themselves and introduce themselves as that, because they felt like it was like a burden for other people to like learn how to pronounce their name. So I remember like there were a lot of I guess I'd say like international students who did have ethnic names, and I like felt bad because I was like, I want to learn your name, but to them it like seemed like a burden to have to like introduce themselves by their own name, so they would pick another name that was kind of similar so that it was like easier for other people to pronounce it. And that again, just like it's been so normalized that like people around my school would just call them by their like quote unquote like white name instead of their like original name. Yeah, I think that was also like kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, like my Starbucks name is Maya, not Medha, just because
Exactly.
it's so much of a hassle.
Mine is
Nice.
Sean.
Makes sense. Like, Jamie, have you ever received a single Starbucks drink where your name is actually spelled correctly?
Oh, no. I've seen so many variations of my name. It's actually crazy.
Yeah.
Like, I haven't even thought of those ways, but they just, come up with it. I'm like, wow.
Do you ever get like
Wow.
a Y? Like J-A-Y?
I think I've gotten like a Jamey or something like that. Yeah.
Oh, I wasn't even thinking
exactly,
about
right?
that.
So I'm like, wow, I didn't even know my name could be spelled like that, but kudos to your creativity. Like,
Right,
yeah.
right. I know. I remember once I literally spelled out my name, and then I got it, and it was like Treya, and it was like Treya, and I was like, that's not even. At least you got the second half, but like,
My
that's not even
dad
close.
just went to the alphabet and went, okay, I don't know, like,
We don't know
what
SH,
S
it's
is.
T.
Like, yeah, it's T.
Also,
Oh,
have y'all ever had instances where like you'd be like talking to a cashier or something, and they like act like they didn't understand what you said when it was in perfect English? Like they play a game where like they're like, "Oh, you're
Yeah.
Asian. Like I'm just gonna act like I didn't understand what you said, so you can repeat yourself 4 times." Like
That's
I
ridiculous.
just don't get it.
Yeah.
That happens to me all the time, especially in New York, actually. But I usually just, like, in my head, I just think, yeah, it's just because of the masks. It's just because of the masks. I'm just gonna... But, yeah, like, as a whole, I think, as a community, like, as we said before, this podcast is a South Asian podcast, but that doesn't mean that we should turn a blind eye to anything that's happening to other people in our community, especially because it's happened to our own community before.
Right.
And I'm not going to be surprised if it doesn't happen again to our community and it doesn't continue to happen. So, like, I guess as a whole, like, what steps, what resources do you guys think that we and our listeners could take if we wanted to raise awareness and get people talking about the issue that's happening of Asian American violence?
I think like the first step is just like spreading awareness. I feel like people still don't realize how what's the word, like extreme the issue is. And like especially recently, not saying that it hasn't happened before, but there have been so many cases of like Asian American violence, especially in New York, and I just don't see that many people talking about it and like discussing it. Like it's definitely a conversation that people need to be having. And especially because it's happened so many times in like even just the last month, I think the first step is just like making people realize that this is like a big issue and this is something we need to act on and at least do something about it. But yeah, I think that's just like the first step.
Yeah, something I wish I had growing up more was more like history and education on minority culture. And I think that could definitely help a lot, right? Then you see someone, you know, understand them as a whole person instead of just a stereotype.
Yeah.
I think one practical thing that everyone can do is just listening, like taking a step back and like not being the one talking, but getting to know other people and like not just bringing up things that you want to like get to know more about because you're interested in. Like don't just talk to someone that's Korean about K-pop. Like get to know like their background and like how they grew up and things like that, not just aspects of their culture that you want to know more about.
Yeah, I 100% agree. It's all about the education and just hearing people's stories so that you understand that there's a person behind every single story and there's a human being behind every single statistic. But
Yeah.
I think that may be all the time we have for today, folks. But thank you so much for being here.
Roshan and Jaime, if our listeners would like to check you out, where could they find you?
You can find us on Instagram at genz.unfiltered, and we're also on all streaming services.
That's awesome. This has been the Saree Not Sorry podcast. Shreya, if our listeners liked this podcast, where could they find us?
Okay, so you can find us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and SoundCloud. And to get any updates on our podcast, you can check out our TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. And our handle for all of them is the Saree Not Sorry podcast.
If you're someone who likes listening to things on the radio, be sure to tune in back on Wednesdays at WNYU 89.1 FM.
All right, thanks for listening.
Bye!